out this is different than a normal presentation. We only have a handful of slides, and you're actually going to watch our panelists today actually have a conversation about issues going on in the CISO community. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this. I think you got a notification about that. We will make that recording available to you on YouTube. That'll be the quickest way to get that to everybody so you can share it out to other folks. And secondly, if you have technical support issues along the way, feel free to put those in the chat pane or the question and answer pane. And just be aware that you're all muted right now, but when we get to the question and answer period, I'm actually going to unmute you folks so you can ask questions to these gentlemen here. So why don't I flip through here? It'll let me advance. Our panelist today, first of all, is Corey White. He's the founder and CEO of Cyvatar. He'll probably give you a little introduction of what that is since it's new. Also joining us are Malcolm Harkins. He's the Chief Security and Trust Officer for Cymatic, and Craig Goodwin, the Chief Trust and Risk Officer from Fujitsu. Gentlemen, I'm going to kick this off to you.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Thank you, Terry. So just really quickly, just a little bit about my background if you guys don't know me, and I'll go quickly through this because that's the boring part. But been doing cybersecurity for the last 25 years, and I've seen so many different evolutions and changes within the industry. And I think you get to a certain point where you realize that you gonna continue, I hate to say it this way, but being a follower or following kind of proven methods everyone else is doing, or you decide, hey, I want to innovate, I want to create, I want to build a new way, a new pathway of doing, whether it be cybersecurity or whatever your passion is. And mine is actually, cybersecurity and also creating. So we created Cyvatar. And Cyvatar is really a new type of security company that focuses on actually providing outcomes to our end customers and doing it in a responsible way. So social responsibility is a big part of what we're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I've been blessed to have Malcolm Harkins and Craig Goodwin, who are both advisors to Cyvatar, to join us here. And I've purposely chosen people that are not shy and are outspoken in the industry. So, this is about us talking about cybersecurity and how we can really make it better. And that ties into the overall Cyvatar mission. Anyway, that's enough about me and Cyvatar. Malcolm, want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Corey, and glad to be here and participate with you. And as you mentioned, I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with Cymatic. Been with Cymatic now just about 6-7 months. Prior to that, ran security and trust for Silence, and then prior to that was Chief Security and Privacy Officer for Intel. So basically 3 companies in 28 years. And so a little bit different than some of the round robin we see with a lot of security chiefs.
Great segue into me then in terms of round robin from me, Malcolm. I've been at a few different businesses. So at the moment I'm Chief Trust Officer with Fujitsu for about 7 months actually, and I didn't time that with Malcolm at all. But before that, 15 years as a CISO, normally building or repairing security functions for a variety of different businesses, and a bit like Corey, kindly said about me, a little bit outspoken maybe at times, but love sharing my views and experiences in terms of what I've seen work and not work. So really excited to be here and hopefully share some interesting conversations with you guys.
All right, thank you, Craig. So I wanted to make sure Craig didn't feel uncomfortable because he's joining us from London. So, and I know it's late his time. So at the end of the day, like many of us, we'll have a glass of wine at the end of the day. And Craig, I think you have a glass of wine. You've already kind of gotten started to close out your day.
I sure do, yeah. I'll leave the bottle there, the glass. I'll bring the glass.
Okay. So we decided to join, Craig in that. So Malcolm and I both have a glass of wine. So we'll be having a glass of wine. And the thing about it is we're all working from home. It is a totally different, environment and world that we're living in now. And the key for me is always doing what is normal and natural. And I don't ever want to be in a place or a situation where you just can't be yourself. Of course, no one's getting drunk in the middle of the day, but hey, have a glass of wine at lunch or whatever, and do your thing and be 100% you is one of the things that has always been a mantra that I've always lived by. Now I have my own company, so if I want to have a glass of wine in the middle of the day, I can do so. And so that's one of the keys around these calls. Each week we'll have different panelists and folks joining us from different companies, some of our partners, and we'll encourage them to have their drink of choice. So just to make it a little bit more interesting. So that's it. Move to the next slide, Terry. As I mentioned previously, it is very, very important for us to give back, especially with what's going on right now with COVID. And as we started Savitar, I really started thinking about this back in the June timeframe. I looked back in my Evernote notes. I wanted us to be socially responsible, and I didn't know what charity. I didn't know what would we do. How would we give back? What would that look like? So I decided, it was many different things I had on the list. And then here you go, COVID comes and slaps us all in the face and says, hey, here's your thing. And living in Orange County, Irvine here, you watch the news and the fact that there's so many, young kids in Los Angeles that are really dependent on those school meals and going to school on a daily basis. Now that has gone away. And there's so many people that have lost jobs, and anybody that's on this call, we've all been blessed to, I'm sure, have a job or have something going for us where we can actually know where our next meal comes from. But there are other folks that are not, and especially children that are not, and older people that absolutely are being affected by COVID. I want to make sure that, we added that social responsibility into who we are, and that gave us, the calls that really fuel Savitar. I truly believe that you have to have a purpose in life, and your purpose in life should also be tied with your job, your company. And I want to make sure those tied in together. And so our revenue that we get from our customers and engagements that we do, or subscriptions that we do actually, a percentage of that goes back to our calls, which is Savitar Cares, and that ties directly back to food banks. And to date, I think we've given 25,000 meals already. And so that's just a testament of who we want to be, and hopefully we've become an example in cybersecurity. At RSA, there's 4,200 companies out there at RSA, and I think cybersecurity, there's a lot of money being thrown around, and we should throw some back to actually help the community. I don't know, Malcolm, Craig, any comments there, thoughts before we dive in?
I think you're totally right, Corey. I think there's a tremendous amount of wealth in the community, as well as frankly a tremendous amount of waste and waste on crappy solutions. And I think if we got more efficient and effective, that would also not only benefit our companies, but we can give back at a higher rate, and fulfill a broader mission of protection beyond just trying to protect the organizations that we work for.
Yeah, likewise, just honored to be a part of it, Corey. I think it's fantastic. It's very rare that you hear that from the industry in general, and certainly something that strikes me coming from the UK when you mentioned RSA there and the number of vendors. You just have to walk through San Francisco to see that kind of real juxtaposition between what's going on at RSA and the other side of life as well. So that certainly rings true with me. And although it's in LA and it's in the California, it makes sense for all of us in the cyber community to be giving back. So yeah, thank you to you, thank you to the organization. I think it's a fantastic thing to be doing.
Okay, thank you guys. Let's move on. Let's dive into the meat here. Terry, are you able to show kind of the first kind of topics we were going to talk about? Actually, I know the first one. The first one is really, we were gonna, yeah, I guess, Malcolm, we'll start with you. From a cybersecurity perspective, how has COVID changed your approach to, securing your organization, what you've seen other companies out there? I know you have many different boards and have lots of insight. You want to take a minute and share what you're seeing and also provide some recommendations as to how we should be moving forward from, COVID and this new world that we live in?
Yeah, well, I think a broad base of companies, and I've chatted with I don't know, dozens of peers over the past few weeks since RSA and since this has hit, and I think you've got obviously that you've got this immediate shockwave of needing to deal with the remote workers, and then the economic shockwave that's hitting their companies. So you have kind of these multiple things of a humanitarian issue and an economic resilience issue that's hitting organizations and communities and stuff. And I think many chief security officers are stuck with the reality of the fact that they're suffering from budget cuts and reductions, because if there's an economic shockwave on the top line, the revenue, companies are going to clamp down on things that are not incremental to net cash flow and net income and that type of stuff. And so you've got the pressure of a budget flattening and reduction in many cases, while you're having to surge to enable remote workers with an increased attack surface. So it really becomes a challenge, and one that I think many have risen to the challenge quite well. But the thing that I've found that's more troubling to me is many of them are basically continuing their current path and basically just scaling out their existing controls that they know in many cases don't work so well. Which again, I look at it and I go, this is an opportunity. Tactically, you might have to do that, right? Expand VPN capacity, go get some more licenses and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's also an opportunity to demonstrate how a chief information security officer, chief security officer can deliver real economic value while managing or lowering risk. And so this is an opportunity to do some transformational things, which unfortunately many are not doing. They're just basically perpetuating the same dated architectures, and that will encumber that business down the road further in many ways. So there's a mixed view that I'm seeing, but I think it's certainly a challenge. It's not an easy one to manage through, but I would challenge peers in the industry to look at this as a opportunity to reinvent and reimagine how they've done things, not just perpetuate the same old dated path of things that we by and large complain about already today. Agreed.
Craig, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree, Malcolm. And I think, so to take your point a little bit further, I think that economic pressure that's pushing on us also pushes us to utilize things that we've also already got, maybe in a different way, or utilize inherent controls things in what we already use, right? And I think, one of the main points of this session was looking about extracting value from existing security solutions. And, I, as you do, sit on many customer advisory boards, and the number of people that have got technologies, won't mention any names, but that have taken multiple years to actually embed and to utilize properly, it's a good opportunity to question what real value you're getting out of those things. We've seen, and me, Corey, and you have talked about it on many occasions, that loads of people go and utilize an AWS, or loads of people will go and utilize a VPN solution or whatever they're using, but then won't really extract the value out of it because they're on to the next thing, right? What's the next big thing? What's the next risk? When actually you haven't reduced that existing risk down to a acceptable level before you've moved on to the next one. So it's not about what's the next best thing. There's also that opportunity to look inwardly and in retrospect, looked at the technologies you're using now and try and extract the best value, because we have to in most cases, right? With the economic crunch, we're going to have to use them better. So I think there's a real opportunity to look at that and the way that you're doing things. And then to your point, Malcolm, I think, in a huge organization like Fujitsu, it's slightly different. I mean, you know, I have to remember that we're incredibly lucky given the scale and size that we're at. And there are a lot of organizations that I've been to that are the same. But the flip side of that coin in the SMB or slightly smaller business world is that you really got to go back to basics with some of this stuff, you know. And I think the positive of this is that economic pressure driven also with the additional risk from COVID and the ways of working will hopefully push us as security professionals to focus more on those basics, get those things right, you know, and realize that we perhaps haven't got the money to flagrantly spend on that cutting edge stuff and should actually be spending on utilizing what we've already got and doing it really, really well, because it does reduce a number of the most significant risks. You know, we look at from our advanced threat center at the stuff that we're seeing coming out, and it's just regurgitation of old stuff. You know, I'm not saying there's not new threats out there and there's new things being created, but those controls that we talk about as being the basics are the stuff that is going to do most impact and give you most bang for your buck.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. And you guys know me well. I'm gonna throw you a curveball. I know we talked about some topics, but here's the deal. With COVID, we've got. I've heard my wife was telling me yesterday that we may be at home until 2021. Yeah, in some capacity. So, does the concept of an internal network, is that dead? Should we be just thinking the workforce is remote? And all the things that companies have built, you know, like, you know, your firewalls and proxies and all those things that you used to have, you know, securing a traditional internal network, does that go away? And should you focus all your metrics and security efforts on a remote workforce? Is that where we should be going now?
I think it depends upon the organization, right? If I'm a factory worker, if I'm in a certain service industry, I can't be remote, right? So there's some aspect of work that will always have to be, in essence, on-prem, and in many organizations will then therefore have an on-prem network. But I think we will see, and I was saying this a few weeks ago, this is just speeding up what would have happened anyways in many cases. And I think there will never be a fully going back to always being in the office all the time. Now, again, I had the luxury of, again, a big company like Craig did when I was at Intel and being at the forefront of technology and stuff like that. So we had started enabling ubiquitous remote access and laptops and all that stuff 2003-ish, whenever Intel came out with its Centrino platform, which was the first kind of built-in wireless laptop. And the other thing that I think, you know, is to some extent a shame. A lot of people were caught surprised by a pandemic, but pandemics have been, you know, it's a forecastable risk. The question is just when it's going to occur. And the unfortunate part, I think, for a lot of Craig and my peers is, one, they hadn't ever thought about it. Two, even if their company had thought about it, IT or the security team wasn't engaged in it. It was some esoteric thing that somebody in HR, the facilities team, had dealt with. And, you know, I grew up under Andy Grove, Only the Paranoid Survive guy, like his book. And when I started running IT and security business continuity, you know, after 9/11 and Code Red and NIMDA, we started building pandemic response plans back in early 2002. And I was a critical part of it. The security team was a critical part of it. And so, you know, for me, hopefully this is also a wake-up call that, you know, CISOs and CSOs and stuff like that, they recognize they need to be engaged in the broad aspects of enterprise risks, and they need to be seen as a key participant, if not the owner of it, in orchestrating those capabilities across the company. And, you know, and I think if we do that, we'll be better prepared for the future, and then better prepared if this has a long tail to it that lasts into 2021 or 2022.
So let me throw a curveball in there, and not even a big one, but how do you measure that? How do you know that you're better prepared? What does measurement of being better prepared for a remote workforce, you know, even look like?
Well, to some extent, you can take minor things. So again, I'll go back into my Intel days. a few years after we had driven ubiquitous wireless and remote access and stuff like that, a strong snow and ice storm hit Oregon, 14,000 employees there. Half of them didn't show up for work because they couldn't get there, right? Schools were closed and stuff like that. Guess what? We didn't miss a beat. Factories operated, designs got done, corporate clothes got done. You can look at even smaller scale issues and see the resilience in your operation because of it, right? And so I think it just becomes one of, you don't know until you're there, but I've always been a view of drill in the extreme to be prepared for the ordinary. And if you can, in essence, stress test your business processes, even in a wargaming scenario, you'll be way better prepared for these unusual, borderline extreme events that are not that extreme when you look at it over a few 100-year time horizon, right?
Yeah. I think there's a concept that I love. There's a book by Jim Collins that talks about built to last, right? Really famous business book. But one of the I think it's that one. So Malcolm's nodding now. If he's read it, then he's going to correct me now. But one of the 10x, one of the principles of a 10x leader in that book is productive paranoia. And although it's a more generalized business book, when I think of productive paranoia, I always think of it as the perfect articulation of what a chief security officer should be doing, right? We've been paranoid. A lot of security leaders are still there, fear, uncertainty, and doubt when we talk about metrics and talking to boards. But this productive bit is what we're perhaps not so good at, right? So productive paranoia. So to Malcolm's point, making sure that we're role playing those scenarios that are paranoid, making sure we're building resilience into our businesses to make sure that we've got the capacity to deal with things that may happen, but at the same time we're being productive. We're not stopping the business doing what it's doing. And the art form of a CISO or a CSO, I think, is getting that balance right. And unfortunately we've only got 34 minutes or I'd tell you exactly how to do that, but really it's tough, right? Is the point. It's hard to get that right, but trying to get that balance between productivity, making sure you need to drive the business, help the business to do what it needs. Malcolm's point earlier was, as a CSO now, we've shifted a bit. We're not just looking at protecting the organization, we're talking about enabling now as well, and it's forcing us into this space, and leaders have been talking about it for a while. But as these leaders, we've got to try and exercise previously this concept of productive paranoia, driving the business, but also being resilient and making sure we build in the buffers within the businesses.
So Craig, sticking with that, from a CISO perspective, I've seen two different types. I want you to deep dive into those two different types and benefits and maybe challenges of each one. But we see the delivery operational type of CISO, and as I'll call really just the technical CISO, and then you'll see the business CISO that is really using security and tying it to business drivers and embedding it into the business. With COVID, how do those two really function and become successful? Is one better than the other one, and what's your thoughts there?
So there's a couple of points. My favorite answer to any security question, Malcolm's already used it up, is it depends, right? So, but it really does. It depends.
Now you sound like a lawyer, Craig.
Yeah. I drink some more wine.
Yeah, you should drink some more wine and say what you really say.
I need to pour some more. I thought it'd make too much noise. So look, I think moving the COVID side bit aside a little bit for a second, I think, in my career, it really does depend. So there's loads of caveats to this: what organization, the size of organization, what the business needs out of its CISO, right? But to make some sweeping generalizations, what I've tended to do in my career is move in a level of maturity, right? So in order to make things work and to get the basics done, you have to start out more operational, right? You have to get more into the weeds of things. You have to understand technically how the business operates. You have to understand what drives the business, where it makes its money, all those kind of things, right? So you have to be in not just technical stuff, but generally in the operational nuts and bolts of the organization to make sure that what you're doing is going to achieve the business outcomes that you want it to. So in kind of a maturity curve, I've started off very operational, but as you move towards a more mature security function, you have the ability to step out. And I'd mentioned a couple of interesting things there. I think when I talk about stepping out, I don't just mean having other security people to do the job, right? In a curve of maturity, what I've always tried to do is to embed security into other parts of the organization. I think for too long or too many times over, a CISO feels that his value is measured by the size of his function, right? And you're only successful if you've got a huge security function. Well, many times the opposite is true. You know, if you've managed to embed security, you know, I think of an example of a previous organization, a heavy engineering based organization or software development based organization. My ultimate goal is to build security into that engineering function into such depth that actually as a security function, I don't need that much money to protect the organization because it's just part of what they do on a day-to-day basis. I talk about quality when we talk about code. You know, all developers understand quality, but not security quite so much. So, you know, you just talk about security as an aspect of quality. Can't deliver quality products, can't deliver quality code if you're not, you know, building security in by design from the outset. So that's one example of being pretty operational at the start, but then moving much more towards business outcomes and driving what the board and the senior leadership team at a business wants to begin with further down the line. I'll stop there because I'm bored of the sound of my own voice. Malcolm.
Okay, perfect. Malcolm, is this where we go to your kind of V formation you talked about in your book and lay that out?
Yeah, you know, and it's one of those things that I had an epiphany when I first started writing my first book 7 going on 8 years ago, and I evolved a little bit further in my second edition. And it's because I'm, you know, you guys know, I'm not a technologist. I'm a former finance guy, business guy, economics background. And when Intel CIO Doug Bush at the time had asked me to run security and business continuity, you know, it was a dialogue of, well, I don't really know much about security. And he's like, well, that's fine. I got a bunch of security geeks who don't know much about the business. They'll teach you and you'll teach them. And, you know, later when I came to start reflecting on what was the skill sets, to Craig's point of the maturation that people needed to go through, I started thinking about, and there was the design company IDEO back in the 70s or 80s that used to talk about the ideal technologist, and they were T-shaped. They had a breadth of business acumen and then a depth of technical acumen. And I started looking at that model and I'm like, okay, that's necessary but not sufficient. The CISO and CISO needs to be Z-shaped. They have to have the breadth of business acumen. They have to have the breadth of technical acumen. And then the hash to create the Z is their risk, security controls, compliance understanding. And you have to grow on all of those scales and all of those scopes constantly because the business is constantly changing. Information assets and technology are constantly changing. Their usage models are constantly changing. And because the business is evolving and the technology is evolving, the risk and security and control requirements are evolving. So you have to constantly grow in the Z-shaped, and then you have to wrap those things in values, kind of like you've done with your social responsibility. You have to have the integrity. You have to have the independence. You have to be willing to risk yourself in order to protect your team, your business, your customers, and society at times. And so for me, it really became a multi-dimensional set of skills and capabilities and leadership traits that we need to demonstrate and continue to strive for.
All right, let me throw you a curveball. What if I think it might actually need to be an X shape. I just literally am thinking through this because
I was just gonna say I'm gonna write the M shape. That's mine. So
yeah, exactly. We'll go through the whole alphabet. But what about Malcolm? What about being a politician? Because we've all seen it. The security guy that everybody freaking hates. And how does that tie into this? Because you've got to be likable. People have to be able to want to work with you and your team to be successful as a security guy.
So there's skills, scope, and style, right? The scope could be a policy wonk. It could be a scope of just having the technical functions, or it could be this full scope chief security and trust officer, chief security and risk officer like Craig and myself have, right? That has more autonomy and more reach and stuff like that. So, and then you've got the skill. You're a business person, a technical person. You've got that Z-shaped. Then there's the style, and I boil CISOs down to 3 styles. They're either authoritative, they're arrogant, or they're affable. And the arrogant ones are frankly the dicks that nobody likes, and they don't generally last long in their organizations, right? I mean, we all know some of them, because we even see them in our peer meetings and we go, God, that guy's or gals, you know, they're just, you know, full of themselves. And I think that the ideal mix is somebody that's affable, that gets along with people, who can work through people, and they're not, you know, just constantly trying to grab budget and grab people, to Craig's point. Because sometimes you got to give control to get control.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you need to be authoritative. You need to have the ability to say, hell no, not happening on my watch. You need to have the confidence and the communication skills that will, at a time of crisis or in a time of need or in a time of a critical decision, you're going to authoritatively state what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, in order to gain movement, in order to gain motion, and to get a real result. And swim upstream at times against the waves, against the tide, in order to make things happen. And so for me, it's that mixture of authoritative and affable, and how you dial those depending upon the context of the situation. And I think if you do that right, then you've got the right style approach.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let both of you guys join in on this one, but I agree with you, Malcolm, but I just think it's not working, because the turnover for CISOs, you guys, is 18 to 24 months. So something is not working in that scenario where there's so much turnover. What's driving that? Is it, you know, that people don't want to be CISOs anymore, too much politics? Nobody cares about security. They want to be compliance driven only and not actually do real security. What is it?
I'll let Craig go first on that one.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. That's why I went. So I think just a couple of reflections on the industry. I think to Malcolm's point, I think, you know, CISO 1.0, if you like, was mostly those heavy techie guys, right? Was the IT guys. Everyone decided they needed a CISO or a security person, so they grabbed the IT guy and put him into a CISO role, right? And some of them are still in those jobs and doing well. And then the other side flip, I think a few years ago, there was this big flip in the industry where I saw loads of big organizations take someone who was completely outside of security, right? So there was a load of large businesses that took someone from project management or program management and made them the CISO, or took someone from risk, you know, financial risk, and made them the CISO, or finance, or wherever. So there was this big shift the other way. And I think that's the extremes, right? I think, you know, there was a sudden rebellion against these IT technical guys because they didn't have enough business knowledge, to Malcolm's point. And now there's been the rebellion the other way. And I think that, to Malcolm's point, the comfortable area is in the middle, right? And I think the organizations are at different levels of maturity, but I think we're trying to get a nice steady in the middle ground there somewhere. So I think the reason it's not working, so I'll give you a couple of reflections from my perspective. You know, I've taken over from all of those different guys in my career, and then depending on where the organization is when you move in, depends on kind of what part of that chameleon you've got to be. You know, you have to be much further down the affable route if you've walked into an organization where everyone hates security, right? Everyone's been told no for the last 5 to 10 years. You know, and you're in this position where everyone's avoiding the security function. It's ultimately failing because things are going out the door without you seeing it, because you become a hindrance to the business, right? And actually, as a chameleon, as a CISO, when you walk into that organization, certainly for the first 12 to 18 months, you've got to be that affable guy, because you've got to reverse the opinions of everyone. And to your point, Corey, that's going to take time. That's a cultural thing, right? And yeah, you might have small pockets of success, but in a larger organization, that takes a long time to get people around to your way of thinking. You know, so that model of bringing a CISO in to do that, it's really going to take him 12, 18, 24 months to get that organization back to a position where they're even going for a coffee or lunch with him, let alone fixing any risks or reducing any vulnerabilities in the business, you know? So you're right, those things take a load of time. And I think those things really impact on a CISO's role. You know, having the ability to get stuff done means you've got to take 12 or 18 months to even have people trust your opinion. One of the things that I always pride myself on when I'm building an organization is not necessarily reducing risk, but is whether the CEO or my peers or my stakeholders in that business pick up the phone and call me when something happens. COVID-19 is a good example of that, right? Would they pick up the phone and say, Craig, what the hell do we do? We need you to help out, right? If you're the CISO that gets avoided and doesn't get the phone call, then you probably need to have a long, hard look at how you're approaching the business.
Yeah, and you know, to kind of add to what Craig was saying, I think, you know, if you look at the turnover, you know, two primary things: either the CISO gets fired, and then the question becomes, why did they get fired? Did they tell somebody to blank, you know, to F off basically and say not on my watch? And they said, okay, it's your end of watch, so they get fired because they held the line. Or did the CISO resign? And then why did the CISO resign? You know, ISSA and the Enterprise Security Research Group had done surveys on security profession over the past few years, and they publish them every couple of years. There's a little bit over a third, almost 40% of the people that are in the security profession do it because of the morality of the role, right? And then when you look at the details of it, you know, CISOs say 50, 60% of us say that there's a lack of executive engagement. There's a lack of a real connection even with the board, right? And then National Association of Corporate Directors late last year in December published a broad-based survey of all the corporate directors of public companies. And it was roughly 61, 62% of them said that they would accept a cyber risk for a business objective.
Yeah.
And so you start looking at it and you go, okay, well, cyber risk is growing. It's a social issue. It's an economic issue. And then you have boards basically saying they're going to trade cyber risk, meaning it's less relevant to them than a tactical business objective. And then, you know, so you've got all these confounding forces, and you look at it and you go, some of that turnover is because basically a CISO works in an organization that gives lip service to security versus really makes a difference on it. And on the other hand, it gets back to the style and the approach, and some CISOs are too heavy-handed with it. And with if that is roughly, you know, a third is the heavy-handedness of the CISO, a third is you got an organization who gives lip service to it, well, that explains 2/3 of the turnover.
Yeah, and I always challenge the lip service thing. I think I don't know how you think about it, Malcolm, but you know, if you take a smaller example than the board maybe, and you look at, you know, an organization, and what I hear all the time in the peer groups is they're not listening to me, right? No one's paying any attention. They're not listening to me. I'm pointing out all these holes and no one's listening to me, right? And I have a real problem with externalizing that to anyone, because I think, well, that's the reason you're there. You know, if a CFO was to sit in a CFO meeting and say, well, I think they should be doing this or doing that or cutting costs, and they're not listening to me, well, that someone would say, well, that's your fault. You need to go in, you need to internalize that problem, and you need to change that. You need to your point, change the way you're communicating or change the way you're approaching the business. Because obviously if you're failing, you're not doing it right. And for too long, I think, as a security function, as a security group, we spent too long moaning about they're not listening rather than internalizing that and trying to find better ways of doing it. Yeah,
completely agree with you, Craig. And I think, you know, there are, there's a bunch of whiners in our ranks, and all they do is whine about
there we go.
They whine about the fact that nobody listened to them, and you know, whiners never win.
Agreed.
So the point around that though is that they're whining for a reason, because because security CISOs especially, they have all the accountability, they have the responsibility for security, but they don't have the control. And so that's why they're whining. So is it that they need to do a better job of communicating? Is that what the big problem is?
Control's an illusion. the CEO doesn't have full control of a company.
Yeah.
The CFO doesn't have full control of a company. There's all these externalities that other C-level execs don't have excuse after excuse after excuse. If they don't deliver a business result and a business outcome, they get fired.
Yeah. And so the last topic we'll dive in and we'll jump into questions is you hit the nail on the head. And this is absolutely key for Savitar as a company is business outcomes, because I've stopped, because the folks that know me for a long time, I used to be highly technical, and I still am to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, being highly technical doesn't actually help, in some cases, companies be more secure or meet their business objectives. The business objectives for some of my clients today is we need to hit compliance. And Craig and I have been going back and forth on this. I think we hit a nice and happy medium, as we all know compliance is not equal security. But why can't you get security and compliance at the same time? And I don't think that people have figured out how to do that within our industry. And I'm curious, Craig, Malcolm, the compliance argument versus security compliance versus security, that's real security. How do we balance that out? What does that look like?
Well, I think to touch on your first point about business outcomes, Corey, I think, and then Malcolm, because I know he's got a great quote waiting for the compliance versus security bit. So, if I think about business outcomes, I think it follows on nicely from the conversation or the rant I was just having there about, taking responsibility and internalizing that problem for not communicating security or risk effectively within an organization. Because, I've walked into a lot of security organizations, and the business outcome or the outcome for the security function that a lot of CISOs will socialize with the organization is to find the holes, right? And you'll see it reflected in our vendor environment as well now. A lot of organizations, a lot of vendors will focus on finding the gaps. And that's where it comes to a position of the CISO saying, well, no one's listening to me. I'm telling them where the holes are, no one's listening to me. But actually, if you look at it, what's the real business outcome? What are we trying to achieve if we're in this together, as Malcolm articulated at the start? What are we really trying to achieve for the business? Well, it's the outcome of that. It's the risk reduction as a result of identifying that risk, right? So we're not saying we've succeeded because we're stopping at identifying the risks. We need to drive the outcome and drive the remediation or drive the action till the point where it's complete. And that might be the removal of a vulnerability. It might be patching something, but unfortunately, patching isn't very sexy, and therefore we focus on the hackers who find the holes, not the patches that fix them or fill them in, right? And I think as a CISO, we need to start taking responsibility for the end-to-end outcome and driving those real outcome and risk reduction.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Craig. And again, it gets back to, I think, the struggle. People know what compliance looks like. There's a checklist. I've hit it or not hit it. But it's hard to, in many cases, explain what security looks like. But the quote, Craig, that I banded around the other day when we were chatting is, compliance is the residue of a good security program. And I think if we focus that way and think about it as a outcome of doing security and privacy right, we will dial it in appropriately. Because if we start with security or if we start with compliance, we all know that you don't end up necessarily with adequate security.
Yeah.
Right. You've checked the box. We know all the breaches that have occurred, and every one of them's been PCI compliant, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, FedRAMP, you name it. Right. So I think if you start with having the right program with the right outcomes, your result will be compliance. You might have some, little minor tweaks or deltas you need to do, but I think it's the orientation that we take that will deliver the destination we achieve.
Well said, Malcolm. So we're going to open it up to questions. Please type your questions in the chat, and I will ask those questions. And I'm looking at some of the panelists, which I know, so I may ping some of you guys for some questions. I'm sure you guys have some thoughts here.
And the other thing I can do is if you have a particular question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can actually ask your question. So Either
All right.
use Q&A
Awesome. Thanks.
pane or raise your hand, and we'll manage it that way. I don't see anything from anybody. Maybe what I'll do is I'll advance
Okay.
the slide, and we can talk about our series here. And then in the meantime,
Okay.
if something comes up, we can do that. Whoops, let me go back one here. Do you want to talk about some of the upcoming things, Corey?
Yeah, absolutely. So while questions get populated, I see some friends here in the panelists. So if you know me, I may ping you to and ask some questions here as we go through this. So what we decided to do, we partnered with quite a few technology partners, and we'll continue on roughly a weekly basis. Number one, on April 22nd, we're going to talk about asset discovery. And I've said this for years, you can't secure what you can't see. And I know that both Malcolm and Craig have some opinions on, I just don't understand why the hell do we build security programs and don't even have a good understanding of our assets and what those assets look like. And, my background, I've done many risk assessments, and I'm kind of on my, assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, NIST and ISO framework kind of perspective. But if you don't actually know your assets and you're monitoring and managing your assets, that is key, that's foundational. We're going to talk about what that looks like and how you can actually solve that challenge. And we're bringing in a technology partner, which is Exonis, to partner with and talk about that. And then next, which is, if you've known me for a long time, vulnerability scanning, pen testing. And Malcolm, I think, said earlier, is that there's Black Hat, there's DEF CON, but there is no remediation conference. Like, where do you go if, there's nobody with shirts saying, I'm the patching guy that makes it, super sexy to be I'm the remediation guy. I'm the guy that fixes shit. That does not exist. But that's the most important. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, it's like you got a broken leg, and then walks out, and I think there's a whole commercial series around that, that's not helpful. I know I have a broken leg, or I know I need to patch stuff. I know I have vulnerabilities. Can you please actually help me fix it? So it's not the sexy part, and we're going to deep dive that, and I know our panelists have some opinions there. And on the 5th, we're going to talk about how the cloud killed the firewall. And again, I used to pride myself on being a firewall guy and building DMZs and architectures, perimeter architectures. But I truly think that the firewall is dying or dead, and especially with COVID, because everybody I'm talking to now is, okay, unless you're VPN into your internal network and then going back out, which kind of actually doesn't make sense. How do you have the same level of security without having a firewall? And then, secure apps. And back in my Foundstone days, we did a ton of application testing type of projects and SDLC and threat models and so on and so forth. Let's talk about what that next evolution looks like. And so we partnered with Contract Security there, and they have a really innovative approach with as it relates to IASC. And so I want to dig into that and see how CISOs are addressing that. And then continuous security validation, making sure that if you buy a bunch of security tools, and I know both Malcolm and Craig, they know CISOs, they just buy everything. And so if you buy everything, can you actually prove that everything that you have bought really works? And so we'll have a discussion around that and what types of tools will actually, prove that you've bought these tools, they work or they don't work, or maybe they need to be just reconfigured or updated to work. And we partner with our good friends over at Attack IQ, which is fantastic at validating that and validating against the MITRE ATT&CK framework and some of the well-known hacks that are out there. So that's the series, and we'll be adding more sessions to the series as we go. And I do see some questions coming in, and Terry, I'll kind of let you manage and unmute the panelists and let them ask their questions as we go through it.
Okay, first up is Scott. You can ask your question.
Hey guys, good to see you all. Y'all look great. So a quick question around your take when it comes to risk management. Lately, we're seeing a lot of the ransomware gangs not just encrypt files, but also then threaten to expose sensitive data. if the victim organization doesn't pay the ransom. And I'm wondering if that, I should say not if, but how that changes the way risk management looks at the threat of ransomware in general. If you look at like of a law firm that has obviously sensitive client information, is that a significant bump in the risk curve?
Scott, this is Malcolm. I think that risk has always existed, and if people are just contemplating it now, they didn't do their job. Plain and simple.
I'm laughing,
Yeah.
right? But
it's the reality of it. Just like if you get an executive or somebody in a sensitive role in a company, and their home systems get taken over, and they find embarrassing or other things on those systems. Could those things be used for blackmail? Absolutely. Is that a different type of ransomware attack? Yes. Should CISOs and CSOs be contemplating that people in positions of trust and are visible in their companies could be blackmailed because of what they have on their home systems, or what their kids have done, or their spouse or partner? Absolutely. Has that existed for some time? Sure. So it's just a matter of, with it now becoming more visible to people, how are they responding? And to be honest, it's just like any ransomware question. I don't believe in paying ransoms, but at the same time, it's dependent upon the context. Sometimes paying the ransom is absolutely the right thing to do, despite the fact I don't like doing it. But then you've just got to contemplate who you're paying it to, and whether or not, if paying the ransom actually is aiding terrorism. Is it doing something that could really harm people beyond just embarrass them or disrupt operations, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that other than to say I've done a load of those ransomware. I think Malcolm mentioned exercising earlier, and you'd be really surprised sometimes at what some of the approaches by executive leadership teams are and how the opinion differs. It's easy to think, oh, everyone would agree with me and we'll never pay ransoms. But actually, having done quite a lot of those exercises, when you're actually in the situation or you're exercising the situation, a lot of people do things you wouldn't expect them to do. So I would encourage organizations to really exercise that and really have those discussions up front, because when it hits the fan, you have to be prepared for that stuff to make decisions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next,
Go into court. Yeah.
I was going to say, Court, you're up next. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Like I said, it started off more as a sort of an observation and comment, but it came to mind that, through all the years of participating in, PCI audits and SOX and all of the regulatory compliance, one thing I observed is, many CISO security teams in general, even for as redundant those activities are, and they don't necessarily equal security, but they're a product of it. We don't use these same processes to really assess our out-of-scope systems. There's mission critical and business critical processes that exist that absolutely need the same rigor of monitoring, access control, identifying anomalies and setting baselines, et cetera, that we do for our PCI and SOX systems. Yeah. So it's extremely important, I think, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and make sure that we're just as diligent out of scope from a compliance standpoint.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you mentioned PCI there, Court. I think PCI is a great example of that, right? The number of organizations that I walk into and say, you say something like, well, do you log and monitor that particularly sensitive data part of the organization? And they say, no, because it's out of scope of PCI. And that's been the age-old approach. And I think, Malcolm hit the nail on the head. It's the way you approach that stuff. If you take compliance as your ultimate aim in all of this, you tend to miss the stuff on the periphery. If you take security as your ultimate aim, and actually compliance is a really valuable offshoot of that, then I think that's the right approach, and a really good way to approach it. Now, realistically, we know that especially with larger or legacy organizations, that often a real challenge, and there is already compliance in place. But I think there's an opportunity as well there to utilize that best practice, right? If you're telling a strong story to your leadership team that says, look, why are we doing it for payment card data? Well, we're doing it because it works. We're doing it because it's the expectation of an external body, because it's the right thing to do. So why don't we take that model, take that rigor, and move that into the areas of the stuff that we want to protect as well, to your point, whether it's personal data or the crown jewels of the organization. So, there's challenges, but I think it brings opportunities as well.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
And Pedro, you're up next. Only I can't get you off of mute, so you might have to do it on your side if you're on a phone. Oops, so now I don't see him at all.
Yeah. Or he can paste his question in there.
Well, I do have his question. It says, can Craig elaborate on his early statement on doing more with the current investment in this economic climate? How do you validate your current stack of tools? Do you have a program approach to validation? How much is automated? How many resources are required to staff?
Okay, I'll tell you one at a time. A glass of wine for you. So I think so. I'll sum up, right? Because in the interest of time, I think in terms of using more from what you've got, a couple of points. I would say we mentioned RSA earlier, talking about vendor trade shows. I wrote a blog a while ago about the value that I got from RSA, because for many years I never bothered going, to be honest. I thought it was just a trade show. I didn't see any value in it, but actually I learned, and actually what I did learn was that I could get some really good contact with my existing vendors, with the people that I was already spending money with, understand what their roadmap looked like, and understand how I could utilize it better, and how other companies were utilizing the same technology. So we don't always have to look for new. We can look at what we've got right now, understand and speak to them more, partner with them better to understand what I can be doing more with my existing technology stack. So that's kind of where I was coming from. How do you validate that? Well, actually, Corey's running a webinar later in the series talking about how we validate our existing security controls. But I would say benchmark against the industry is always a good thing there. And resources is hugely dependent upon what you're talking about and what you're using, I think.
Okay, I think that wraps up all the questions. Do you want to do a wrap up here, Corey?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for attending. Great questions, great comments. Thank you to the panel. And I'm gonna give Craig some shit because he didn't finish his wine. I don't know if Malcolm finished his wine.
Not exactly, but that's the day.
Well, you have to finish the whole bottle.
I filled it up again.
Okay, you filled up again. See, I got last week left in my Sauvignon Blanc because it's 10 a.m. on the West Coast, so I still got a lot of work to do. But I will finish the Sauvignon Blanc with the wife after 5. But again, thank you guys. This is I think it's been fantastic, and I think this type of engagement is really important. I want everybody to realize it is not about Savitar. It's about you guys. It's about us helping the cybersecurity community. It's about us helping the folks in need, especially now. And that's our success will literally be, this is a Corey quote, I guess, is a byproduct of who we are. And that's how we roll here at Savitar. So again, thank you guys so much for attending, and we'll continue to move on and move to the next webinar in the next week.
Thanks, Corey.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers, Malcolm. Cheers, Corey.
All right. Thanks. Bye.